Right now, you are wearing clothes. You probably put them on this morning without thinking. You picked something, you put it on, you moved on with your day. It felt completely automatic. But here is the strange part. For most of human history, no one did that. Not a single person on Earth. And when the first human finally did reach for something to cover their body, it was not because they were embarrassed. It was not because they wanted to look good. The real reason is far stranger than you think. Your ancestors were naked for a very long time. Not occasionally naked. Fully, completely, permanently naked. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens and the species that came before them walked across open grasslands, slept under open skies, and raised their children without a single stitch of clothing. And they survived. They thrived. So the question is not just, why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? The real question is, what changed? What happened that made a naked body suddenly not enough? To answer that, you need to go back roughly 170,000 years. That number is not a guess. Researchers like Melissa Toops at the University of Florida used a surprisingly clever method to figure out when clothing likely began. They studied lice. Specifically, they studied the genetic split between head lice and body lice. Head lice live in hair, body lice live in clothing. They are different creatures, and their DNA tells a story. When body lice evolved as a separate species, it means there was already clothing for them to live in. The DNA of that split points to roughly 170,000 years ago, give or take. That is your best estimate for when humans first started covering themselves. But 170,000 years ago is a very specific moment in human history. It is not random. It lines up almost exactly with a period scientists call marine isotope stage 6. That is a technical name for something your ancestors experienced as pure survival horror. It was an ice age. Not a mild cold spell, a severe, prolonged planetary freeze. Glaciers spread across continents, sea levels dropped, ecosystems collapsed, temperatures in some regions fell by 10 degrees or more. Your ancestors were pushed to the edge. The fossil record shows that the human population may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals during this period. Humanity almost ended. And in the middle of that collapse, someone wrapped something around their body for the first time. Think about what that moment actually required. Your ancestor had to look at a dead animal and think something no creature had ever thought before. They had to see the animal not as food, not as a carcass, but as material, something that could be used, something that could be worn. That is not an obvious thought. That is an enormous cognitive leap. It requires abstraction. It requires planning for a future state. It requires imagining yourself differently than you are right now. Researchers like Francesco De Rico at the University of Bordeaux have spent decades studying the cognitive revolution that took place in this period. The emergence of personal adornment, symbolic thinking, and body modification all seem to cluster around the same era. Clothing was not just a survival tool. It was one of the first signs that your ancestors had a self to express. The earliest clothing was almost certainly animal hide. You find a dead animal, you skin it, you drape it over yourself. Simple in theory, extraordinarily difficult in practice. Raw animal hide is stiff, heavy, and rots quickly. To make it wearable, you have to process it. You have to scrape it, stretch it, and treat it. Archaeologists have found hide-scraping tools at sites across Africa and Europe dating back more than 100,000 years. These are stones with specific edge shapes, used specifically to process animal skin. The tools preceded the clothing. Humans were preparing hides long before the full clothing system developed. They were practicing. Then something else happened. Humans began using needles. The oldest known sewing needles in the world were found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, dating to approximately 50,000 years ago. They were made from bird bone. They were small, precise, and had a drilled eye at the top for threading. Someone made those. Someone spent hours shaping bird bone into a needle fine enough to push through leather. That is not survival improvisation. That is craftsmanship. That is intentional, skilled labor directed toward making clothing better. It means that by 50,000 years ago, your ancestors were not just wrapping themselves in hides. They were stitching fitted garments together. They were making things that had shape, things that fit the body. And that shift from draping to stitching changed everything. When you move from a draped hide to a sewn garment, you gain something critical in extreme cold: trapped air. A fitted garment creates a layer of warm air close to the skin. That layer is what actually keeps you alive in sub-zero temperatures. Without it, your body loses heat faster than it can generate it. With it, you can survive environments that would kill you in minutes if you were naked. This is why researcher Ian Gilligan at the University of Sydney argues that fitted, sewn clothing was not a luxury. It was a biological necessity for humans moving into cold environments. It was the technology that allowed Homo sapiens to walk out of Africa and into places where no primate had ever survived before. Look at the map of early human migration and it becomes obvious. The moment your ancestors began making proper, sewn clothing, they started showing up in places that were previously uninhabitable for them: Northern Europe, Siberia, eventually across a land bridge into the Americas. Clothing was not just warmth. Clothing was the passport. Without it, the entire human expansion across the Northern Hemisphere does not happen. You do not happen. But warmth was only the beginning, because somewhere along the way, clothing became something else entirely. Look at ancient sites across Africa and the Middle East, and you start seeing something interesting. Shells with holes drilled through them, ochre stained on bones, decorative objects. Long before humans needed clothing to survive, they were already adorning themselves. They were already using their bodies as a surface for communication. Researchers like Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London have documented these early ornaments going back more than 100,000 years. Some of the oldest beaded jewelry in the world predates sewn clothing, which means that when clothing arrived, it did not just join the practical toolkit, it immediately plugged into something deeper: the human need to signal, to show who you are, to mark yourself as part of a group. Tribal clothing is one of the oldest social technologies in human history. When everyone in a group wears the same pattern, the same dye, the same cut, it communicates membership without words. It says, "I am one of you." It also says, "I am not one of them." In a world where stranger danger was literal, where encountering an unknown group could mean death, being able to instantly signal your identity could save your life. Clothing became a survival technology in a completely different sense. Not warmth, social identity. And once clothing started carrying social meaning, it never stopped. Every piece of clothing you own is doing two things simultaneously. It is keeping you at the right temperature, and it is telling the world something about who you are. Those two functions have been inseparable since the very beginning. You dress for the weather, and you dress for the room. Your ancestors did exactly the same thing in animal hide and bird bone thread. So the next time you open your wardrobe, standing in front of it for longer than you should, trying to figure out what to wear, know this: that moment of standing there, calculating, deciding, is not modern vanity. It is one of the oldest human behaviors there is. You are doing what the first clothed human did 170,000 years ago. You are using a piece of material to tell the world who you are. And somewhere in the deep history of your species, in an ice age that nearly wiped out everything, a human reached for the first time for something to cover themselves with. And the world was never quite the same after that. Neither were you.